This is a highly rehearsed talk that we've put together. Okay, so let's get started. The thing that Scott and I wanted to talk to you about is something we did last spring, right? It was a class that we co-taught here at Penn State University in the College of Education.
Do you want to introduce yourself? I know everybody knows who you are, but...
Oh, yeah. I'm Cole Camp-Lees. It's nice to meet everybody.
That's it. That's all you have to do. I'm Scott McDonald. It's nice to meet you. That's up there.
Yeah. So
we didn't have to say that up.
Now, I'm the Director of Education Technology Services and part-time teacher in education. And Scott, you are?
I'm a faculty member in science education, so I'm a full-time teacher in education. And Cole and I co-taught a class last semester.
Yeah. So where did this get started? This got started, we sort of were hanging out, and we said, wouldn't it be cool if? And that's really the way it started. It was sort of interesting. What we wanted to do is we wanted to sort of try to balance rigor with emerging technologies and see how students could sort of live up to those two sides of the house. And so the story that we're going to tell you about is about this little course that we came up with, Curriculum Instruction 597C, Disruptive Technologies for Teaching and Learning. And it was kind of interesting, I think, the way we sort of set it up, and we'd like to share that with you. And when we walked into class, we said this to our students. We said to them, this is going to be a grand experiment. I mean, I think it was the way we framed it on the first day. Some of our students are here, and we're going to ask you to join in on this party that we're putting on right now. So, but it was a grand experiment because we had no idea what to expect. I used to teach in the College of Information Sciences and Technology, and in IST, you can have sort of expectations and assumptions about your students that you walk in and they're sort of plugged in already, right? That they're sort of already dialed in, and we didn't really know how that was going to play out in the College of Education.
I think, and to go back for a second to the wouldn't it be cool if, the reason that Cole and I had that conversation is that we play a lot with these tools, but Cole doesn't play with them as much in class because he has fewer classes, and I had not really committed a lot of time and energy to thinking about how I could play with them in my classes and really think about how these tools that we used, excuse me, very powerfully in our own lives could be used by students in teaching and learning contexts. So that was the wouldn't it be cool if.
Yeah. And the big grand experiment part was, will any of this work? Will any of it stick? And so the story we'd like to share with you today is sort of the story of the things that really sort of shocked us, the things that came out that we didn't expect at all. I mean, there was quite a bit of that kind of stuff going on, I think, throughout the entire semester. Let's give you a little bit of the structure, though, before we get rolling here. We did several readings every week, and these were, I guess, Scott, we'd call those, they were based in theory.
Yeah, we sort of had, we had basically two sets of readings. There was some core social theory, and that was pretty rigorous, and we can talk about how that played out in our constituency among our students. And then the others were sort of applications of that social theory to teaching and learning environments. So things like the Clutre Manifesto.
Yeah, so pop culture social theory.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so that's where the readings were focused for the course, were around those two strands.
And we'll show you the list of technologies we used, and they were big. And we used Angel, right? We did use Angel, and we'll talk a little bit about how we used Angel. But for the most part, most of the students did all of their reflection in the open in their blogs, in personal PSU blogs. And there were good reasons for that, and we'll get to those. But I think it's important to know that while they were reading, they were also having to do quite a bit of writing, I think is probably a fair assessment, several of those a week, and also thinking critically about what their classmates and their peers were doing, and we had them reflect upon what they were saying and link back and forth, use trackbacks and other things to sort of cite each other's work through the blog platform.
And we were really conscious of the fact that we wanted it to be out in the open. We wanted all the pieces to be out there so people could not only see the work, but so that the students could understand the impact of their work being out in the public, because that's one of the Web 2.0 sort of issues that we wanted to deal with directly. So we can talk about how some of the specific things we did around that, but it wasn't just that we wanted them to publish to a larger community. We also wanted them to see the impact of that publishing to a larger community on who they identified themselves as scholars and students.
Mm-hmm. We did weekly discussions. This was a face-to-face course. This was not an online course. This was every Thursday from 2 to 5. in the afternoon. So it was, it was really driven heavily by these blog posts and the conversations and the social rating site that we'll show you in a second as well. The students were in teams, I think literally like right away, wasn't it? The first or second week, you had a really cool method of putting students in a team where you passed out playing cards and they randomly assigned themselves to teams. And that was so that they could sort of work together, get to know each other, and do presentations together. And they each chose a technology to think about and present on, and some of the outcomes from that were really surprising as well, I think.
Yeah.
The design of the course, there were 3 blocks, and when I say us together and them, really the way it played out was Scott and I handled the first third of the class. We really assigned all the readings, we did all the stuff that we felt was important to get things moving. The middle section was really a mashup of the things that they were reading about and would share back with us, and so the readings became very organic in that way. And the last third, the third half of the course, was all about them. They drove the entire experience. And again, this was a graduate level course, so I think that works. I traditionally have taught undergraduates, and I ought to say that this has not worked as well with 75 undergraduates. We're 100 in the Cybertorium.
But we should, did you just say how many we had in the class?
We had 20,
18. We had 18 in the class, so that does make a big difference. And we organized the course around these 3 major themes, so community, identity, and design. They come at least in part from A.T.N. Wagner's work on communities of practice, but we had our own spin on those things. But the students were asked to really comment on those 3 themes and all the work that they were doing, whether they were looking at a technology or whether they were reading social theory. It was all bound together around those 3 things.
And those themes became very important as we explored the depths of the Web 2.0 space, really, because while publishing in the open, they got to see firsthand what their impact on their work did from a community perspective, what it meant for them as individuals and as a group. And really, the piece that we hated to miss so much was the real design piece. And I think if we had another semester, we would have probably run a course just specifically around design, because that sort of got left out.
One of our students called design the Jan Brady of our course, so it sort of got left out a little bit. No, it was definitely Jan, because Marcia got Brooklyn.
Right.
Yeah.
Marcia.
Marcia. Thank you. So this is Cole and I yesterday were talking about how to capture one of the main themes that we had to deal with in terms.
This is real data.
Oh, right. Excuse me. So this is data that we collected yesterday in Cole's office that reflects one of the sort of core themes from the students in the first half of the course was what made my head hurt. And that's a direct quote from one of our students. And what this is a graph of what made our students' head hurt. But there are 2 lines. So we had sort of 2 pretty clear constituencies. We had the technology people who spent a lot of time designing, playing with technology, thinking about how technology works in learning spaces. And then we had, for lack of a better word, the social theorists. So the people who were education, doctoral students, and master students who had some background in social theory. So are you going to be Vanna White here? Is that what you're doing?
As you notice, the technologists are in orange, and the theorists are in green.
And the important thing is that the axis here is technology.
And the other one.
Yeah, and so you could see our goal over time was to get around technology to get the theorists' heads to hurt a little less, and I think the technologists' heads hurt a little less too. But the change. There's like a statistic for that, right? Like
it's real. Just go with it.
So then, of course, the graph for the technologists look like this.
Theory.
No, but this is on the.
Right.
It's the technologists' attitudes about theory. This is the graph for
We're still analyzing our data.
It's
very complex.
It's in progress. Yeah. This is more of a poster than it is a final set of.
Yeah. So what you're seeing is an early slice of the data, I guess is what we call that. But the point here is what really sort of shocked us was that there was equal pain, right? There was it was evenly distributed. The pain scale was evenly distributed, if you will, where the ones who were really adept at doing the high-end reading and the discourse seemed to breeze right through the readings, while the technologists really struggled with that, and the other held true, and that was really interesting. But what was really, I think, so stunning was how towards I would say the middle of the second third, you can say that, I guess the middle of the course, they really did come together on both sides. And we started to see a real increase in participation across the board from both camps with both areas. And I think one of the things that we're trying to stress here is that if you go into this and you want to focus on technology, one of the questions we're going to ask at the end is, does this work outside of a class thinking about technology? Is that the patience is sort of core to being able to pull this off, because the technology does cause pains just as rigor causes pain.
Right. And we had to spend a lot of the first third of the half course discussing those issues with both groups. So we had to convince the technology people to sort of hang in there with the social theory, because they would really come in and say, I read that last night and I could not understand it. It was like reading a foreign language. And the the people with less technology experience were struggling just as hard, because we were pushing them from the beginning. They were having to post on the blogs. They were having to go to these different aggregation sites. They were having to do a lot of hard work with the technology, and it was not simple for them.
Yeah, so if you think about the technology that we introduced, and some of these are formal, right? Some of these are the kinds of things that we use every single day in our classes. Angel being one of the big ones, but we threw in the Penn State blog platform because we really wanted to see what that meant to students. And we have a whole bunch of other things here. We're going to talk first about these two pieces, I think, and then we'll come back to some of these other ones.
And those, the first two pieces that we're going to talk about were the core, more formal pieces that we had predetermined pretty well how we thought they were going to play out in terms of the course structure.
So we're highlighting some of our students' blogs right here at the front of the site. So student blogs, and why did we do this? I think that the big reason is that we wanted to give people their own space. Remember, we have community, identity, and design in here. And we wanted people to be able to establish their own identity by having a blog at their own URL. It felt more personal. It was theirs. It belonged to them. They could make decisions on what did go there, what didn't go there. They didn't have to be bound by the rules or the procedures or the policies of the class. It was really their space. And I think that over time there was a sense of ownership that was established because it wasn't necessarily locked away inside of a top-down driven environment like Angel. I'm not saying Angel's not a good environment, but for something like this really seemed to play out very well, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. And I think the other important thing, as we've said before, is it was in the open. These are blogs, so anybody could read them. And we did start to look at the traffic that the students were getting to their blogs as part of the course.
Yeah, and so let's say this. About these blogs, we had many of the students installed Google Analytics on their personal blogs. And this is relevant because we did it at the class site as well. And students were getting 5 to 7 unique hits a week, okay? So to them, that may seem like something, and it may not seem like much to you, but once you get a comment from somebody out there on your blog, it really feels like people are actually paying attention. Now, when you sort of think about what we did there, they were all out at the edge of our network, right, at the edge of our class, and we struggled with how we were going to bring this together. Even with 18 students, the idea of going around and visiting 18 different blogs, even if you have RSS, is really brutal. So we used a piece of software, open source software called Plig, social aggregation software, that basically takes every single post that happens at each student's blog and brings it into a community. Automatically brings it in and does some interesting things with it. So here's a student's post that happened in their blog, but it ends up showing up in this social rating site. The students were asked to read the post here primarily and comment here. And we wanted the commenting to go on here because at this point we felt as though that the community belonged to the class, right? That the community knowledge existed within the class structure. Students were awarded how many? 3 votes a week? Is that right?
Yeah, well, that was supposed to be the maximum, and then some students voted less than that, but that was the maximum, 3 votes a week.
So basically what would happen is as students would see these posts, they could vote on these posts. The top posts for the week, they could click this link, a lot like Dig if you're familiar with Dig, and it would add a vote to it. If they voted, they had to say why and have a discussion or engage the author in a conversation related to what was going on in that post, right?
It's actually quite similar to the live question tool that we're using right now, right?
Fact. So you guys see what's going on here? Basically, they're all publishing out here. They own it. And all this content is coming together at the middle where the commenting is going and everything else. During the first, I would say, about 6 or 7 weeks into the course, we hooked up Google Analytics and we started to see we were getting about 1,000 unique visits a week in our course community site. Now, that is a huge jump from the 5 or 7 students we're getting. And the really interesting thing is what started to happen is people from outside of the class started commenting and pushing students around in different directions as well. And actually, we had a really interesting conversation about a couple of Scott and my colleagues who had come in and added posts, and we started asking, are they lurkers? Are they part of the class? And does the community now extend beyond the walls of the classroom? Really created a whole new social dynamic.
Right. And it got at a lot of the core issues about identity. When does somebody become an identified member of our community? And we can talk about some other really specific, interesting cases with that, where people participated in class discussion without being in class. So
And the last thing I'll mention here is we use the vote count to determine the overarching questions that we would ask the students for the week. So the vote count, the highest voting discussions, Scott and I would tear those apart a couple of nights before class, and then we would write 4 or 5 guiding questions that would drive literally, John, what do you think, 2 hours of discussion about? Yeah, and then people would raise their hands and say, my head hurts.
Yeah.
I think is pretty much what happened most of the time.
Right.
So that's really interesting, and right, we sort of figured that something like that would happen. We were really surprised at the number of people that showed up at the community, but what changed the game, I think, is the story of this and for camp. Let's go back to our technologies here.
Yeah, and what we need to say is that, just briefly, what we've just described are the top 3 bullets. And the remaining things were used in class to varying degrees, but some of them were assigned to the student groups, and they had to go out and use these tools and then come back and talk about them to the class and lead part of a class discussion. So Angel we use mostly as a repository for readings, and Delicious was something that Cole and I introduced as a tool that they might be interested in using. But Twitter, Facebook, wikis, podcasts, and YouTube were all core technologies that one of the student groups in the class had to take. They had to describe to other people in the class. They had to develop an assignment for people to use it, and they had to do some sort of synthesis at the end using these technologies as well. So those were much more integral to the course. The interesting thing is that the Twitter group originally didn't want Twitter. Everybody got to pick a list of things that they would have, that there were their choices. And the Twitter group really wanted Facebook, and somebody else got Facebook. And they were really angry.
That first weekend, I got an email from one of the students, and she said, Twitter's the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life.
Yes.
And we said, yeah.
Yeah. So use it anyway.
Yeah. And some interesting things happen.
Right. So we're going to concentrate on Twitter because of that initial reaction of the student group and what actually happened as it played out over the course. Because that was, as Cole said, and as we said in that last slide, that's the technology that really changed the game in our class, surprisingly.
So some things started to happen. We ended up with these, I would say, extended conversations that would go on. If I would jump on Twitter that evening, literally what ended up happening was that the students started, right in class the first couple of days, they got Twitter accounts, they started following us. And it's funny because the Twitter team did an evaluation or analysis of what their first tweets were across the class, and all of them said the same thing: this is the stupidest thing in the world. By about 5 or 6 tweets in, they were starting to say, I see potential for value here. And as it started to go on, there were conversations, and we'll share some of the quotes with you, that were going on during off hours. I mean, class was literally a 60-hour-a-week endeavor because it was just ongoing. The extended community was really interesting because during the presentation, Robin, Shannon, Daniel, I don't know if Daniel, but other people, they were joining our class. So while the class was going on, students were twittering out things that were going on, overarching questions, ideas, things that were happening, and people from outside of the class were chiming in with responses and links.
Through Twitter.
We knew it, but we weren't promoting it. It didn't bother us. Actually, it was kind of very, very cool.
No, but one of the things related to that became really interesting is it began to become clear to Cole and I who the people in the class were that were regular Twitterers and who were not. Because the people who were regular Twitterers were connected to each other. They talked to each other. They seemed like they were old friends. And you could literally see this in the face-to-face interactions. And the ones that weren't Twittering were I hate to say marginalized, but essentially they were less a core part of the in-class discussion. They weren't as connected to the community.
I would say they were certainly less engaged in what was going on in class.
Right.
And there was a rich set of back-channel conversations going on that I think was probably even more surprising to me early on than anything else.
Right.
Because of how they were helping each other, prompting each other, pushing each other to ask questions, to say certain things. And they were doing it sort of invisibly behind the scenes, but it was alive and it was happening. And Scott and I kept our laptops open and kept the Twitter, and we would join in and push people to say stuff as well.
Yeah.
And I think a couple times we asked them to step it up a little bit via Twitter, and it happened. The external participation I talked about, but it was just pretty incredible. And really what happened is this. I mean, the learning community came together around this one silly little Web 2.0 technology, more so than any other technology I've seen in a classroom. It was this one little thing, 140 characters, what are you doing right now? that changed everything and really bound the community.
Yeah, and like I said before, I mean, I think you could see tangible effects in the class. You could literally see the kids. I use that term.
I used it all semester.
Yeah,
and they
the kids that were Twitterers were definitely a tighter knit group than the kids that weren't. And
there were 3 that didn't.
Yeah, there were right. There were
and they were
3.
physically. What was very interesting about this, and this is a sidebar, but they actually started sitting in the same part of the class at the start of the semester, and their physical location was a representation of their engagement in the class. It was very, very interesting to see. So just a couple of quotes. This was stuff that came across during class, and this was to a question I think I asked about, has Twitter made an impact in the classroom? And to see this twittered out, I don't know who did this, but I feel I know you, Scott, and the others more intimately than I do other professors and classmates with whom I've spent more time. And you notice they already got the 140 character saving C-mates up there. Yeah. They got it going on.
And then this one was one that that I found particularly interesting. So one of the things that the Twitter group did when they presented is they explicitly used Twitter as a parallel channel of conversation. So they asked people to Twitter things. So this quote, your identity is defined by the communities you participate in, so your choices to participate are how you control who you are. I mean, this is substantive learning theory talk that's going on amongst these students while the whole class discussion is going on in parallel. So I think that's the thing that really blew me away about this, is that you expect that Twitter would have a social impact, have kids talk to each other more.
Passing notes.
Right.
That's what we thought.
Right. And we thought that passing notes would continue. What we didn't expect is that the passing notes would become substantive, that would be learning-focused passing of notes during class and public notes, right? So everybody could read them. It wasn't, me passing to Cole with a little check yes if you're be my friend or no if you won't.
BFF.
Though I did pass him some of those notes in class. But yeah, BFF. But the notes were like this.
Yeah.
Which, and especially when they're constrained to 140 characters, it's fascinating to see the sort of stuff that they were posting during that, particularly during that class. I mean, it happened in every class, but in that class it was a designed piece, and it was amazing.
Yeah, Scott, I mean, I'm sure, and when you were teaching high school, right? I mean,
high school,
you would confiscate notes, and a lot of them said stuff like this, right?
Yeah, almost. The bottom quote. We're almost always. I was thinking about the trajectory of the rocket.
Dance, and your identity is defined by exactly. But this one sort of really blew our minds. This happened right at the end of the semester. Yeah, see, we're getting some reaction.
The aha moment.
So this was a Friday, I think. And this student twittered out and said, I just found out that my thesis is due Sunday or I can't graduate. And instantly, you should have seen the Twitter community come to this student's rescue, this class community, where they said, we'll read it, we'll proof it, we'll help you think about it, we'll get together, let's talk, let's go and get together at the library and do what we need to do. Yeah. But it was just phenomenal to see how over the course of just 12 weeks, this group had come together, and only a couple of them had known them. This was interdisciplinary, it was cross-listed. These were not students going through the same program. How everything sort of emerged and came together towards the end, where it was, I would say, a real community, wouldn't you? Yeah.
And as a side note, he did graduate and completed his thesis, and now just 2 days ago, there were a bunch of Twitters about getting together to give him a sending off party because he's moving to Philadelphia. Yeah. So that group has continued, and they're still getting together in meet space based on conversations that are happening on Twitter.
So we didn't know that there would be so many questions, but we sort of staged a few of them just to jumpstart some thinking and talking. But this was the number one thing we struggled with. And I think it's probably not a mystery when you start to see such a distributed production of thinking going on, right? Where you had students writing just amazing things in their blogs. You had students doing really thoughtful reactions to these comments. And then you had all these social tools out there at the edge where, especially Twitter, where, almost, let's say 75, 80% of the class were spending a great deal of time having really in-depth conversations about what was going on in class.
And so the artifacts that students were producing were across a whole range of these tools, some of which we formally captured and some of which we didn't. So there were probably, 20 or 30 different podcasts that were produced over the course of the semester. There were Twitters, there were blog posts, there were Flickr streams, there were Facebook groups, and all this stuff, either to lesser and greater degrees, represented these students' contribution to the class and the community and the thinking that they were doing around these issues. So Cole and I sat down to try and evaluate this, and
that was not easy. And I should add that we didn't ask them to do all this stuff. It just sort of happened. The social piece took over, and learning became interesting, it seemed like. And now, did it take us more time to evaluate it? Maybe, but it seemed a heck of a lot less rigorous than grading, the dozen or so papers that you typically do. But evaluation was very, very difficult, and we'd be happy to talk more about that if you have questions about how we went about doing that. And some of our data suggests some.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you think about a traditional course, one of the core things that all students look for in the syllabus is, how am I going to get my grade, right? So if you looked at what we said at the beginning of the semester about how they were going to get their grade and how we actually determined their grade, there was a relationship, but it wasn't one-to-one because there were students that did tremendous amount of work that if we had stuck to our original criteria for evaluating them, they would have suffered. Because they're, we can show you some of the pieces that they made. One student made this incredible mashup did a Google map with connections to all the different blog posts from various people in the class. Heather's here.
Hey, Heather.
Heather's here too. And that wasn't part of the original plan. We didn't have that in our framework for evaluation. So we really had to think hard about this because, when somebody's posting one blog post a week, but they did 50 Twitters, 25 of which might have been on task, sort of focused on our learning community. Do we just say, well, that doesn't count? Nice work. So it was a struggle that we had.
Yeah, and I can't say enough about the fact that our students were flexible enough to let this go on. I mean, I guess we had the big caveat of it's a grant experiment, so you can do anything you want to then, right?
Right. Is that how it works? Because I'm just going to say that at the beginning of everything I do then.
That's what we do at work too, right? Wendy knows.
This talk was a grand experiment.
I don't know. Predicting the unpredictable. Why Twitter and not something else? And this is something that really confounded us because we didn't think Twitter would be the thing, right? We all hear all this buzz about Facebook and other social networks that have presumably more depth associated with them. And we had this expectation that they would sort of gravitate to something like that. But in reality, maybe it was the simplicity of Twitter. But the next time, and we've talked about this, if we teach this course again, what's going to happen there? Yeah. I mean, we just don't have any idea.
Right. And by the time we teach this course again, who knows what the tool sets are going to be? Twitter seems to be have some staying power, which I think is another surprise about it. But it is a question of, if we were to run this course next spring, which would be a year later, what are the tools we'd be using? Would they be the same tools? Would they be different? And how would we rethink it? But I think we would likely not be able to predict what the powerful tools would be.
Yeah, I think the point is that we couldn't design that. As designers, we couldn't walk in and sit down and say, okay, faculty member X, this is what you're going to do with your students, and it's going to take off, and it's going to be revolutionary. And I think that the point here is that there has to be some agility in our approach to learning design as we go forward. We have to be thinking critically about what is this toolkit that we have at our disposal, and what are the affordances. But at the same time, Twitter may take off, and you have to figure out how you do your assessment and what's going on there with it.
And that, I think, leads directly to the last question, which is, what is this course? What lessons can we take from this course that apply to courses that aren't about how technology plays in learning and teaching environments? I mean, that was the focus of the course. So it's easy to make the argument, well, we're going to try lots of tools, and you're going to think about how they work in learning spaces, and you're going to talk to each other about that, and you're going to push each other. But if the course is physics or communication or history or some other course, it's much more difficult to have that fluidity of tool set and to let people say, oh yeah, we're going to try all these different things and you're just going to use the ones that stick. So it's a question that Cole and I have had conversations about, and we certainly don't have answers. But I think we're thinking about that, because otherwise it's just a little isolated garden that plays well by itself but doesn't tell us anything about the larger community of how these tools work in other teaching and learning environments.
But I think the good news here is that we built the course around the theoretical components that we wanted students to walk away with, just as most learning environments have. And I think what we were flexible enough about is letting the tools take the students where they wanted to get to. I mean, the rigor would have existed regardless. They would have walked away, they could have answered their, they could have written their paper at the end of the semester and had a very insightful set of evidence to share, but at the end of the day, it seemed to happen in the social environments as well.
Yeah.
So those are our questions and answers. What I think we're interested in is looking at some of these and getting your reactions to what went on.
Well, and I think one of the questions, and I think Gary asked it, but is directly relevant to the way this question tool works. So he asked about social ratings and concerns about, how that played out in the class. Specifically asking about writing and having the writing evaluated publicly. I mean, one of the struggles that we had with our students, and it became a part of the conversation, was, are we writing a blog post that's supposed to be like a reflection for class, which seems like a very formal piece of writing that others are not going to find interesting and are not likely to vote for? Or am I writing a blog post that people find funny and interesting and therefore will vote for, but may or may not have the same sort of intellectual rigor that a reflection on writing would have? Because if you didn't write something that people voted for, then it didn't get included in the larger discussion. So it led to some interesting problems.
Titles and lead-in sentences to get people to vote. I mean, there were sound bites. Even the responses turned into like 140 character catchphrases, like you'd see on the National Enquirer, and then the rigor was underneath that. It was interesting.
So that's the Jan Brady of themes, right? So that came directly out of that problem of, how do I get people to read my post and vote for it, even though it has some intellectual rigor to it. So.
But the direct, I'll turn the mic over. So were you nervous about having people vote your stuff up and down during the class?
Initially, yes, but it was more of an encouraging tool because, one, people do get intimidated by writing. But what was nice is that your classmates came in and said, oh, that was a really great idea, or that was one of your best blog posts. And you're sitting there going, yeah, right. But it was good to have their encouragement and have their help and thoughts.
Could you please tell me what your Twitter name is? There are a core group of us that keep following you, and I was so excited to find out you were going to be here that I just kind of feel like I'm probably to go.
My Twitter name is Jean Marie D. That's me.
Cleverly disguised as Jean Marie.
And I'm JJD24 over here.
You can look him up on LDAP.
And I don't have a graphic to go with mine yet, but I'm Notorious Red. So.
I think that's all the students that are here. Is that right?
Yeah. The rest of them's got D's, so we didn't include them. We're still working through the data. There's some incompletes and things like that. So I think now, I don't know, you still have a mic up there? Yeah. What reaction to the whole writing and being evaluated per se in the open?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head with my take on it was that you did have to be a little bit clever, at least to get people with your lead in, because there were posts that were very dry, very academic, that were very relevant and on point, but you were like, okay, yeah, moving on, not going to get my vote, and it was a little bit of a ego boost for me. And probably a lot of the other people in the class to say, like, wow, I got 5 votes, because you went from, when you posted something on your blog, it initially went in sort of into this purgatory until it got
news.
Yes, until it got at least 3 votes, and then it moved over to published news, which was a little bit more of a distinction. And so, I was always thrilled when my blog post, like, wow, it moved off of, the bill became a law kind of thing. So. So I always try to think about, well, okay, yeah, I'm addressing kind of what the subject is, but I need to come up with, here's my hook, here's my Jan Brady comment to make it a little more.
And before Heather talks, I think the interesting thing too is as you see here, posting early pays dividends, right? Yeah. So if you post early, then more people see your post because they're posting later. If you post right at the last minute, right at the deadline, then you're not going to get the votes. So there was a sort of social pressure to post early if you wanted to get out of the purgatory.
I think the one thing I should mention is we didn't do real assessment in this environment. I mean, we didn't then come back and assign grades or anything like that. So there wasn't any of that kind of stuff going on. That all happened either face-to-face or behind the scenes. We didn't use the public forum to say, you're not writing well, you're not doing this, your stuff's ill-structured. I mean, that didn't go on here. This was really peer-level kind of reflection on what was happening. So I don't think we broke any rules.
What I really enjoyed about this format was the possibility for ongoing dialogue. So everybody was tasked with reading everybody else's post every week. You didn't just go through and pick, one or two and then vote on that. I don't think that I was too influenced to use the catchy phrases for whatever, that was perfectly fine with me. What I liked doing was reading other people's work, and when I found something to hit on with that, if I could challenge them, then they could come back with something. And let's see what else. Yeah, that's...
My head hurts, right?
Say that again?
Our head hurts, reading all those posts.
Right.
I did want to point out that the system is doing very well. You're getting 7 votes for Welcome to the Live Question tool. That's great. So those of you who voted for that, good work. So Bart has 11 votes, so he's really popular here, and he's asking, do you know if your students are still utilizing the tools you explored in the class? Our estimate, there's still a really rich Twitter thing going on. I can tell you I'm subscribed to all their blogs, and no, they're not posting. John, you posted like 2 times after class. That was about it. There were a couple of other lingering posts here and there. Now, we have had students move their blog and have continued blogging, so they're writing, but they're not writing in the blog that they set up for the class. So that is going on, which, in my opinion, is a good thing. Students writing is always a good thing. So getting them introduced to this idea of instant publishing and things is very good. But Twitter seems to be the place where things have continued on, wouldn't you say? I mean, the Facebook group has trickled.
Yeah.
There's still a couple little things, invitations to go out and do stuff still happens there, but that's about it.
Yeah, but almost all of it now is through Twitter, so that's where the community carries on. So, do you want to?
Any age or gender differences? No. I mean, we had one student who had been a teacher for 20 some years, and she was the first couple of weeks, very against this idea. She was, but then something happened. I don't know what happened. Twitter, yeah. An aha moment happened, and now she runs a very popular Ning site for horseback riding that's very popular. Lots of people coming to it. She's talked about reinvestigating her career as a K-12 teacher to go back and introduce these technologies. So I think at the beginning, across the board, there was a resistance. I don't think it had anything to do with age or gender. Even the 3 who didn't participate in Twitter were heavily engaged in Facebook, and we thought it was because they would say, well, social networking's stupid, and then I'd walk back to the back of the room because everybody had laptops, and I'd sneak a peek, and they'd be updating their status on Facebook. So there was something going on there that they just didn't get that one piece. But they're still participating, I think, in general.
Yeah. And I think sort of to build on that, and one of the questions that's still on the screen from Robin and Stevie is this, who was uncomfortable with the technologies? And there definitely were. And the people that tended to be the more uncomfortable with it, as you saw from our data earlier, it is a great graph, thanks, yeah, is that the social theorists, the education people were the ones that struggled with it. But one of the interesting things that came up in the class that academics struggle with is sort of ownership of ideas, because this is one of the things they were sort of worried about. Okay, if I put this out there, my ideas are now out there and available to everybody. They're no longer my little private ideas that someday I'll become famous for. So I think that was a conscious conversation in the class. What do you do with these things that used to be private ideas that went to peer-reviewed journals to be published, and as opposed to just putting stuff out there? So people posted, sections of papers they were writing and parts of their thesis, as we saw before with the master's student. And some of those were posted in the open, either in a wiki or in a blog for people to give feedback on. And that became part of the conversation. But there were absolutely people in the beginning who said, is there a way that I can put this, protect this so that nobody else can see it?
And we got a lot of that at the beginning. Can my blog be private? Is there a way that all this can be private? And we sort of asked them to trust us for a couple of weeks.
We said no.
And that became an absolute, literally became a non-issue. And as a matter of fact, the openness seemed to increase motivation to participate early and often, I would say. As far as course evals, Stevie, we don't know. We don't. They're not back yet, are they?
They're not back yet.
Yeah. So we don't know how it'll shake out.
They're great.
Yeah, they're going to rock.
So we have access to the system.
Yeah, I know a guy. Hefner knows how to get in there, so everything's good. I can hear my faculty asking, students are already hooked up to text messaging, iPod, and all kinds of digital gadgets. Would introducing more technology then push them farther away from concentrating in class?
Yes and no. I mean, I'm looking around here, and some of you are not concentrating in class, right? And I'm guessing that part of what you're doing is on-task behavior, and part of it isn't. So the question, I think, from a learning perspective is, to what degree do you care, and to what degree are you obliged to make your environment engaging enough that they stay engaged with you both inside and outside? And I think, you know, if we went back and looked at how many hours our students spent thinking about the issues that were involved with our course, I think they spent more, even if some of those hours were not necessarily in class. If they were checking their email or updating their Facebook in class, there was clear engagement outside of class that went above and beyond what students are doing. I mean, you have numbers on how much time they spend doing homework. Mm-hmm. Our students were doing a lot of homework, and that homework came in the form of talking with their peers in Twitter and in blog posts, but it was still a lot of engagement. So it was definitely a trade-off, though. I mean, I think as I'm not jokingly saying about this room, there are people in here who are checking their email and maybe updating their Facebook account and those things right now.
And we're taking note of who you are.
We are. We have a camera at the back of the room in each section. So, and that goes back to the evaluation.
But I think that this idea of using distributed technologies creates distributed engagement. And what I mean by that is that it may be something that's not happening while you're in face-to-face, where you're giving up some control. And let's get real, when we go and we listen to people talk about what's going on in their classrooms, the fear is control, right? You have to be paying attention to me, all eyes on me, ears up here. And when you walk away from that and you give up some of that control, it's very complicated and it's very intimidating. So the idea of allowing them to participate, hopefully in a meaningful sense, behind those screens, because they're all there. I guest lectured in Bart Purcell's freshman IST 110 class the other day, and their eyes are glued to the screen, but you ask them questions and they're able to respond. Now, are they engaged in what's going on? Only evaluations and assessment can really tell us that, but you have to be willing to allow some time to be swapped, because you don't save time this way, you just shift time, because there's more engagement going on Tuesday at 3 p.m. than there happens to be during class time. It just is the way it is. I think maybe, more and more. We should have Heather and John and Jean Marie talk about it. Yeah, and for World Campus students, I could see where this would really be a really interesting thing to further shift the participation in class, because in many cases it's an asynchronous environment to begin with. So to have this ability to shift participation works if you can figure out how to assess it.
Well, I think the question is for you three is, to what degree did you feel these technologies distracted or kept you off task in some way during class? And so does it disrupt your conversation to have these as a part of the class that you could engage with during class? Because we didn't police. We may have walked around and made notes. But that's not really policing, is it? No. So,
just because you're not sitting up straight and looking to the front of the class does not mean that you're not learning, And so I think for me it really questions what class is, and what we were doing made life more fluid inside and outside of this physical classroom. And so it was inside the classroom, everything felt a lot more natural and a lot more comfortable, the way that I think people are able to learn. It just enhanced a comfortability, and it took that outside of the class because the physical boundaries were really lessened, and there was a lot of bridging and merging going on.
What was also nice is that we were able to pose questions to Cole and Scott if they would say something and we had an idea, we could ask a question and still be respectful, yet we get our ideas across. Or the same thing would happen with a classmate. A classmate would make a very good point, and we say, well, what'd you think about that? What did you mean? And we'd be able to get an instant response.
Yeah, it did allow for maybe fewer interruptions that you might have in a more traditional classroom environment, where, as Jean Marie said, if you didn't if you misheard, or if you missed a point that somebody was making, there might be a tweet that went out saying, wait, what? And somebody would say, and repeat whatever that was. So that allowed for whatever was going on in the front of the class to keep going. My personal experience was it was a little disconcerting initially to see so many people, staring at their laptops, including Cole and Scott. And, that because I teach undergrads as well.
We didn't do that at all.
And, you wonder, like, you sort of revert back to the mentality of, the teachers aren't paying attention to what I'm doing, so therefore I'm going to, do something else. And I remember one class in particular that somebody put a tweet out there that said, Cole and Scott aren't paying attention.
And people outside the classroom said that's typical. What happened.
And we did respond to that tweet quite quickly.
Yes, they put the hammer down, but yes, we are.
Five new readings tonight.
So it did take some getting used to it, but I do think it added a lot of value to the class to have that going on.
The question I would have is how do you socialize these tools in a typical classroom or a distance classroom? I mean, there was a natural community that emerged within our room, but there's that transfer question. What happens when you step outside of a room where you're willing to do that kind of work? Somebody's like, who wants a new iPhone? You can have it. I'm confiscating that one. Did somebody have a question? Yeah.
In the affective domain, like building confidence, getting a sense of appreciation of something that might be a little bit more difficult to. It has to happen in a social context, and so for a world campus environment, that's a tough learning objective to try to accomplish. But this might be a tool that would get you there.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, I'd be interested in supporting work in that space. I mean, if it's something that anybody across the university, world campus or otherwise, wants to think about, we can put a group together to do just that. And I think that a lot of the things that we're thinking about in resident instruction are moving into the space. And Larry, you and I had this conversation before about that it seems to really work in an online world, maybe even better than it does in a resident world. It's just it takes a little bit of time to rethink some of the design that we do around these kinds of things. So I agree with that. This is my Phil Don.
Thank you, Phil. I guess I'm thinking about it, from a faculty perspective, and I like the idea that, it's really about time shift. Are we requiring, however, in the use of these technologies, an increased amount of time from faculty to be paying attention? I mean, in my resident-based course, I go in, I do my thing. Maybe I have office hours. Maybe I run into someone in the hallway, but it's confined to sort of more or less a defined time frame. Now I've got this space. And I'm doing a faculty development program right now online, and I can tell you the biggest fear from individuals getting started into this is this going to consume me? And do I have to invest, 24/7 to do this?
Well, I think part of that relates to the control issue, which is that if you feel that you are the Uber teacher, you're the person who has to be in control of all the community's interactions regardless of what interface they're happening in, then yeah, I can see it absolutely consuming your life. I was much less active in Twitter than, say, Cole was, so I would post and I would read, but I wasn't doing it constantly. So there are two sort of intermingled questions. So one of them is control and one of them is evaluation. If we're going to evaluate that Twitter stream, then I have an obligation to pay some attention to it. If I'm saying these are tools that we're going to use in class, and I recognize that there's going to be substantive conversation that happens there, but I'm not going to worry about evaluating it, then that's a different thing. I think it's the same question in almost all parts of teaching, but which is this balance between what I want to control and what I want to develop on its own, and then what I want to assess and evaluate versus what I want to just be, you don't, in a regular class, you're not going to follow your kids around and listen to every conversation they have, hoping that, well, if they have a conversation about my class outside of class, I can give them points for that. I think the same thing is true with these tools, is that the idea is you participate to the degree that you want to. Now, I think as one of our quotes said, I think there is clear value for teachers to engage with their students in this mixed social academic way. So in that sense too, I think there are powerful incentives for teachers to do it, which when there are powerful incentives, that can lead to it sucking up time. I mean,
Yeah, I can say I spent a lot of time on this course, and I don't have a lot of time. I mean, it's the one thing that I don't have. I mean, I'm like Jason Hefner, whose name tag says, I need more time to make more time. And that's really where I think Scott and I both are. I mean, this is not all we did. We have real jobs, you know, he's teaching several other courses. So time was an issue, and I found myself shifting that time again, Larry. The one thing we didn't do, we didn't have any office hours. There were no office hours whatsoever. There was nothing posted related to office hours. We had the 3 hours we showed up in class, and it was everything I could do to carve out the 3.5 hours, the half hour before and the 3 hours during class to be there. So I don't think it was any less time, but it was just time in a different sense. And, you know, I'm engaged in a lot of these tools now, I mean, for an organizational purpose in many ways, because we're trying to build community across campus and things like that. So I was already there, but I'm with Scott in saying that if we were really truly assessing it, we would have had to pay attention to it in a very different way. And Twitter does not provide the right kinds of tracking and long-term historical reference tools that we need. We tried to go back and find stuff that happened in our class that we saw live, but Twitter has closed down archives more than 2 pages deep. I mean, when we first started with Twitter, I could go back to my first tweet 2.5 years ago and see that. In the recent months, it's gotten too big, so they've closed that down. So there's a history that's just gone, and we're fools for not capturing it as it was happening. But we didn't know.
Right. So Matthew has a question about the quality of writing, and did we use blogs and Twitter, did using blogs and Twitter cause students to write in a less than correct grammar?
LOL, that never happens. I mean, WTF, what kind of question is that? No, it didn't. It didn't, did it? I mean, I didn't see that at all.
No. I mean, within the context of Twitter, it does. I mean, there's no way that you can be posting in Twitter and not basically posting in phrases and chunked, dropping lots of vowels, and you're sort of trying to get the twoosh, right? The exactly 140 characters. So so there's a lot of that sort of playing with language, but I think actually there in many cases there was a lot of craftsmanship that went into those small posts because you had to be succinct. And I know that's a cliche, but I think it actually happened. I think you saw people really worrying themselves a little bit about trying to make a pithy, funny, but on point sort of post. And the blogs I don't think were an issue at all. Most of the students were good writers. The only thing that you saw was less academic writing and more sort of general interest.
But we put an end to that. I mean, about 4 weeks in, we called them out, and we said that you're going to have to crank up the level of your writing, right? Because it wasn't that it was drifting to more informal. It started that way, and we had expectations that it move to a more formal style. And as you would with any of your students, we pushed them to be more rigorous with what they were doing because we were reading all this stuff. I think.
We wanted more explicit connections to this serious social theory. We wanted the class to be a rigorous class about how you apply social theory to these new tools. We didn't want it to be a class about aren't these tools cool and look at all the fun things
absolutely.
I can do with it.
That was not the goal. So I think we have time for one more. Which one do you want to do here? An easy. Let's do an easy one.
Refresh and see if anybody got more votes while we were sitting here.
Okay, let's see. We got that one. Emily, Jamie Oberdeck. Who wants it more?
Oh, you just got to vote. You just got to vote right there.
Jamie, okay. Well, this is a question that has a lot to do with design, believe it or not, because of the availability of technologies and tools. And so Jamie wants to know, given the current budget realities of the university, how difficult it is to get funding for these initiatives. I mean, we didn't get any funding for this initiative. I mean, we used a little bit of Jason Hefner's time to set up the Plig environment. I managed the aggregation. It wasn't that difficult. It took me, an hour to do. The blogs at Penn State are there. It's available. There is a concern about the commercial world, the .com universe versus the .edu, and we pushed our students to investigate the open social tools, and so that's a concern to think about. But most of this stuff is open, available, and it's out there, and it's just a matter of taking a little bit of time. And you're going to hear about a lot of these tools today during the lightning talk round. So,
but I think one of the questions that maybe is implicit in there and came up as part of the class was the ownership issue, and particularly ownership of identity, right? So students, we started to talk about, well, you put this data out there, you put this stuff out there, and people can take it and do what they wish with it. We got another free phone, 2 in our talk so far today. So there was a lot of discussion about how much you want to reveal about yourself, with the understanding that people can go into Facebook and scrape that data and use it for things other than what it was originally intended to be used for. So I think that's one of the big questions. And again, related to that is this question that Cole and I now have. We have a group that wants to do research on this class and go back and try and capture some of these student artifacts. And many of them are in these environments like Twitter that are, we can't get that stuff anymore. It's gone.
For obvious.
Right.
To get our Twitter stuff
Freedom
back.
of Information
We can
Act
do it.
or something. Yeah.
We can do it.
So I think that was one of the issues too. So there were issues about, what if you rely on a tool and it goes belly up halfway through the course, if you're using Delicious and suddenly Delicious goes away, then that's a non-trivial problem.
The last point there about admin buy-in to develop these ideas. I mean, I think one of the things that what we want to do as a central learning technologies group is support this kind of innovation in teaching and learning. So that means if you're out there and you're trying these kinds of things, you have to tell us these stories so they can go from being one-offs in the back room to becoming services that everybody can take advantage of. So if you find this stuff interesting, if you want to hang out and talk to Scott and I about it, please do so. If you want our assistance in designing something like this, we'll tell you more about what we did and didn't take from all this grand experiment. But any parting shots?
No, I think that's good.
Thank you for your questions. Thanks for your time. I hope it met your expectations. So.